So let's talk about some of the things that maybe we should consider before we jump up and say, I do, and stand. On a big picture, we have the commander in chief. Did you know that the president is not the commander in chief unless Congress declares war, an actual declaration of war? Then he becomes commander in chief. How do you feel about that? If a commander in chief were to enact martial law and you were a soldier, would you follow orders coming from the commander in chief? That would be unconstitutional. Because when a president or a leader asks the military to run a government, that is called a military coup. Now, there's certain ways that a martial law could be enacted, usually by a governor of a state, but not on a federal level. So it'd be unconstitutional. How do you feel about that? I mean, I don't believe in it at all. But let's say you're one of the foot soldiers and you're like, well, why are we here, Sergeant? I mean, these are U.S. citizens. It's martial law. We have to follow the orders and take away their guns. How are you going to feel about that? Especially if you knew that it was unconstitutional and therefore illegal. How would you feel about that? We have Social Security. A lot of people call it an entitlement. Some of it call it a benefit. What do you think about it? It's a tax. And the Supreme Court said it was a tax and it was not insurance. And that's how it got passed. So it's an entitlement by virtue of the fact that politicians made a promise that you would get some money when you retire if you did what they said all those years of your working life. So it's based on a promise from a politician. But the reality is they can spend that money on bullets or Band-Aids or your retirement. It goes into the general fund. There is no Social Security fund. There's a set of books that they keep with a ledger that's maybe called Social Security, but it goes into the general fund. It's no different than the military fund for buying guns. How do you feel about that? Did you know that? We have a Board of Education, EPA, all these things. If you had to stand and fight and you were a school teacher, would you go against the Board of Education, the Department of Education? Because they have no right. They do not exist in a constitutional republic. So they're unconstitutional. How do you feel about that? You're a teacher. How do you feel about that? The founders used to say, well, if there's poor people, don't make their life too comfortable because they'll become lazy. Let them suffer in their poverty, and maybe they'll pull themselves out with their own bootstraps. How do you feel about that? There was a lady in history that petitioned Washington or the Congress for her husband who was killed in battle, and she had no money. She was about to lose the estate. They told her no 5 times. So there was no VA bill. There was no benefits package back then. How do you feel about that? See, all these issues are very important to us today. They weren't when the Constitution was written. There's fish floating up in the ocean dying from toxic waste. How do you feel about that? Because the EPA has no constitutional authority. It might have some act that gives it some pseudo authority, but has no constitutional authority, and I shouldn't have to fund it. How do you feel about that? Do you think any of these are good or bad? How do you feel about that? These are questions you need to think about when you choose where you're going to stand on issues. Private property. Let's talk about property. Back in the day, see, you had to be a landowner to vote. Now, you didn't vote for presidents and senators back then. You just voted for representatives in your community. Everything else was done through being appointed a senator by the Congress, who was elected by you, or by the electoral colleges, because the electors were picked by representatives in your area, voted on by you. So you didn't really vote that much at all, just for a representative. So you had to be a landowner to vote for a representative because you had a stake in that community because you owned land. You were just some drifter that blew on through and go, oh, it's election day? I'll vote on issues I have no idea what you're talking about. And that's why women couldn't vote, because back then women didn't own land. Didn't mean they couldn't. They just didn't. Women voting in the 17th Amendment, I think, whenever that was passed, was because they had screwed things up so bad that now we voted for senators and now we voted for presidents. But back before that heap of garbage, you voted for a representative in your community. You voted for a mayor. You voted for a sheriff. And if you weren't a property owner, really your opinion didn't mean anything. So how do you feel about that? Because that's the way it was. So if we did away with the 17th Amendment and we now appointed our senators to do what we tell them to do, and we only elected representatives from our community, things would run better because we would have our representation back. We don't have it now. So these are issues when we talk about rebuilding the Constitution, because the society has collapsed, that we need to think about. Standing armies, we talked about that. How do you feel about that? Because it's not constitutional to have a standing army. And the founders warned against the standing army because they had been up against the King of England their whole lives, even when their families were back in England 600 years ago. Rome, once they fell, they had their standing army. That's why the army could not cross the Rubicon, because then they became a standing army that the Senate could say, go enforce our rules here in Rome. That was a breaking point for Rome. That's when they started sliding off the cliff and collapsed, when Caesar crossed the Rubicon. So how do you feel about that? Should we still have a standing army today? I don't know. I mean, the world hasn't collapsed. Everything seems to be running smoothly. So, well, who cares? But when that day comes, and we all know what that day is, when SHTF happens with a bang, it is the end of the world as we knew it. America is trashed. The economy of the world is trashed. Everything's chaos. Post-apocalyptic scenario. And we're going to want to rebuild what we have. That's the goal usually for standing, right? It's like, got to stand up and fix something here. Are we going to rebuild America the way it should be? Or just we're going to go back up copy to 1920? Yeah, because we have a backup copy of that. Let's restore to 1920s. Oh, wait, why don't we restore to the 1800s? Why don't we restore back to when it was ratified? No, let's just restore back to Y2K. Everything was good then in the 90s. No, I'd rather restore back to the 80s because everything was good then. So where will we restore to? And it is my belief that we should restore back to the ratified Constitution, because that's when it was perfect. It was best. Everything else has been added to it. So when you stand and where you stand will be important, because will you be fighting for principles that we believe are principles now that support a failed ideology that was added to the Constitution? I mean, a lot of people, I'm sure, are union. I have no problem with unions. They take away your freedom for me and you to sit down and go, I can't pay you that much, but I'll give you room and board, and I'll give you a company car, and while you're learning, I will teach you, and then you can work your way up the ladder. Well, we can't do that, see. You can't accept that offer, and I can't give that offer because of unions. How do you feel about that? Do we want to fight for that? Or do we want to go back to just free America, where people can make a fair exchange? I go to the survivor down the street and go, I got a pound of beans and you just killed that beef, I'll trade you. Okay, see, fair trade. That's what free markets were. How do you feel about our economy? I mean, everyone says we're a capitalist society. No, we're a free market society. How do you feel about that? We got a lot of people preaching for socialism. How do you feel about that? Because socialism has failed every time it's been tried, just like democracies have failed every time they've been tried. Now everyone's like, oh, it's like we don't remember that we watched this episode of Gilligan's Island 80 times in the past? I guess not. So how do you feel about that? These are questions you need to simplify and sharpen and hone down and remove the clutter to get back to what it is that you want as an outcome from your position of where you're standing when that day happens. And most people maybe wouldn't look at it that way, but that's my job. To go, yeah, we'll all stand, but where? I mean, I was talking to a city councilman, almost a year ago. And we were talking about the town's, economic prospects. And he goes, well, the city is practically bankrupt. He goes, in fact, the only reason we're not bankrupt is because we can do some maneuvering to keep that from happening. And I guess I shocked him when I said, well, that's good. I hope we go bankrupt. And he's like, what do you mean? And I go, first of all, if the city is bankrupt or not, it does not affect my life. The water is pretty much mandated by the federal government that I have to have drinking water. Garbage is not a problem because I have a dump trailer. I'll just throw it out. I don't need you to pick up my garbage. It's cute, neat truck and all, but I don't need that. I go, the city does nothing for me other than provide water that I need. And if you couldn't even provide water for me, I think I could deal with that too, because there's water. And the only reason I can't drill a well is because the EPA won't allow me to. So I go, quite frankly, I don't care if the city goes bankrupt. I go, why don't you close the public pool? That costs $400,000 a year. He's like, well, but people count on that. I go, so? Let them build their own damn pool. So I wasn't, I guess, understanding just what it was that he was trying to tell me. It's like, to him, the city's going bankrupt. To me, it was like, so what? In fact, if I want to be in a constitutional city, your public pool and all this regulation would not exist. So if you do away with the golf course that you guys seem to think you love so much, that would save a lot of money because it's in the red, $150,000 a year. Do away with the public pool. Stop driving around harassing people about weeds in their yards and actually do something. I wouldn't need the city at all. In fact, there's nothing the city does for me that I need. I can handle it all without them. So my point is that if it were an issue in a collapse, he's like, we need to fight to save our city. I would be the person going, what are you talking about? Nobody cares about your city government. In fact, we did fine before you incorporated this garbage can called a town, and we will be fine after you go bankrupt. So I choose not to go stand over there with you on this issue because you bring nothing to the table as a city. So that was me drawing a line that on this issue, I do not stand over there. And it's that way in every aspect of federal government. If someone came to me and said, we need you, Mark, to pay more taxes because the school needs more books, I would say, no. Well, we're going to start a bond election. Will you buy a bond? No. Because I don't agree with the education system the way it is set up by our federal government. Go get the money from the feds who took it all from us. But don't ask me for a dime. And in fact, they have bond elections all the time for these colleges, these local community colleges that are going broke. And it's like, don't they teach economics at that college? Because it seems like they're always over their budget. They haven't learned how to write up a budget and follow it. Why the hell would I go to that school when they have no business sense and they're a business college? No, I will not buy a bond election. No, I will not vote for this initiative that wants to raise my taxes so we can go off over here and pick daisies and sing Kumbaya. No. So these are issues that we will all face when that day comes to stand. Where will you stand? And it can be as simple as a school board going broke to your right to bear arms. We all draw lines in the sand all the time. And when all of a sudden it collapses and the tide comes in and washes all the lines that we've drawn off the sand, where will you stand? What will be the hill you will die on? To me, it's freedom and liberty. Nothing more, nothing less. I am free. This is my property. These are my rights, God-given, and that's it. You have problems with your neighbor's color of his house? Don't come knocking on my door because I don't care. So yes, I will stand, but I will stand far over there, fighting for principles that most people will think didn't even exist. And we all need to make those choices. We do it every day in our family lives. We need to go see Cousin Bob. No, he's a drunk and a bum. Yeah, but no, I got stuff to do here at home. I'm not going to waste $700 in 3 days to go to Bob's just because he's got a stomach ache because he's suffering from alcohol poisoning. No. So it's the same thing. The difference is on that day when everything falls apart, where will you stand? And it's those kinds of decisions that I think we need to look for. Will we fight for a system that has let us down for the last 150 years, or will we fight to rebuild a system that was perfect 200 plus years ago when they ratified the Constitution? And only you can make that decision. And the only way you can make that decision is to understand the Constitution. So I'm going to take a break. We've talked a little bit about the choices you'll have to make. Now we'll wrap it up.